This is FLOSS Weekly. I'm Doc Searls. This week, Jonathan Bennett and I are talking to Jeremy Ruston, the creator and maintainer of TWiT. It's a really good show, and that's coming up next.
Podcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
This is FLOSS Weekly, episode 620, recorded Wednesday, March 10th, 2021. TWiT. This episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by Barracuda. Hackers are always looking for the weakest link in your security configuration, especially your email security. Barracuda's new threat analyzer tool helps you gain visibility into your particular vulnerabilities. Visit barracuda.com/floss. Good morning, good evening, and goodness wherever you are. Welcome to FLOSS Weekly. I'm Doc Searls, and I am joined this week by my lovely co-host, Jonathan Bennett.
Hey,
Good
Doc,
morning.
how are you today?
It's still roughly morning where we are. You're holding down Oklahoma there?
Yes, I was joking around with our guest in the pre-chat. I'm not in the middle of nowhere. That is actually a town in Oklahoma. I'm close to there.
My mother is from Napoleon, North Dakota, which is not named after Bonaparte, but after some other Napoleon. And the joke about that, considering the fact that she was born in 1913, and it was that it's not the end of the world, but you can see it from there.
Sounds about
I'm
right.
sure they have some of those places in Oklahoma as well.
Yes.
So our guest this morning is Jeremy Ruston, who came off a bench he didn't know was there when our other guest was unavailable to us, and I am so grateful. So are you familiar with Jeremy? Are you familiar with TWiT by now?
I was
which is
not.
His main invention.
Yeah, I was not until, what was that, yesterday that he got tapped to be a guest? I was not until yesterday,
Yeah.
So I started looking
It
at
was
TWiT.
yesterday evening.
Yeah. Last minute, we were kind of scrambling. No, I started looking at TWiT, and it's really an interesting idea. This kind of multiple page views in a single view. It seems to be the central concept there, but it looks really fascinating.
It is, and we can go into more of it, but first, I need to let you know so we can hurry into this thing that this episode of FLOSS Weekly is brought to you by Barracuda. Hackers are always looking for the weakest link in your security configuration, especially in your email security. If you can find your vulnerabilities first, you can defend against cyber attacks. From traditional malware to the latest spear phishing, account takeover, and conversation hijacking, Barracuda has identified 13 types of email threats. And the thing is, it takes several different layers of security working together to protect you effectively against all 13 threat types. If you're not fully protected, cyber crooks are going to figure out where you're vulnerable. It's literally what they spend all their time on. When they can find the gap in your security, they just need to choose the right threat type and customize it to get into your system, which can end up costing you millions of dollars and your reputation in the market. Here's where it gets hard. With hundreds of highly targeted, personalized threat variants emerging daily and many different kinds of on-premises and cloud-based email systems, it can really be challenging to identify your specific gaps or vulnerabilities. That's what the Barracuda Threat Analyzer is for. It's incredibly simple and fast to use. Go to barracuda.com/floss and answer a few multiple choice questions about your email security setup. It takes about 2 minutes, and the Barracuda Threat Analyzer provides a custom report telling you which threat types you're most vulnerable to. And you'll get custom recommendations on how to strengthen your defenses against those attacks. It's free and very easy to use. Barracuda's December spearphishing report found 12% of all spearphishing attacks are business email compromise. That's up from 7% in 2019. That kind of growth shows how successful these attacks can be. There are real-world examples of this. For example, in my case, when I was running my own email server at home, I found that because I was frankly unprotected, I had an enormous shop set up inside my system. Got rid of it, but it was a lesson. Barracuda reports that according to the FBI's most recent internet crime report, business email compromise attacks led to over $3.5 billion in losses. The government of Puerto Rico lost $2.6 million in a single attack last year. Even Shark Tank's Barbara Corcoran fell for one of those attacks last year. Her employees fell for an impersonation attack and paid a fake invoice wiring of almost $400,000. They were lucky enough to realize what they had done in time to recover the money. Manor Independent School District in Texas wasn't as lucky. They made fraudulent payments over a whole month, losing $2.3 million before the attack was discovered. So, does your email security protect against those attacks? Try Barracuda Threat Analyzer today for free and get a full report showing exactly what you need to do to secure your email. Go to barracuda.com/floss and find out where your hidden threats lie. That's the Barracuda Threat Analyzer at barracuda.com/floss. Okay, so Jonathan, are you there, sir?
Yes, I have an interesting story from, I don't know if it was technically this past week, it may be a couple of weeks ago now, picked up by Phoronix, I think kind of broken by Michael over on Phoronix, about the Linux 4.12 RC2 kernel. Was eating file systems, and I thought this was interesting for a couple of reasons. So the Linux kernel, obviously all of its development gets done out in the open, out on the mailing lists, and Torvalds will release release candidate kernels, and these are known to be dangerous. You know, these kernels come with a big "here be dragons" sort of warning on them, and this is a really neat example of why they're considered dangerous. There was a bug in the kernel that the offset was not being properly calculated for the on the hard drive swap space. And so when a machine started reading from and writing to swap, it was actually writing to whatever hard drive partition happened to be either right before or right after the swap space. And so the kernel was writing, swap trash right over people's file systems. And apparently anyone that ran the kernel for any length of time had their hard drives trashed as a result. It's
That's not good.
Well, it's not good if you ran this particular kernel on a production machine, but it's kind of one of those cases where if you ran this kernel on a production machine, you kind of deserved what you got.
Yeah. Wow. Well, my small piece of news is about Google's new approach to the post-cookie world called FLOC, F-L-O-C. I forget what that stands for, and I don't think it matters that much. But my link on that is to the EFF's piece called Google's FLOC is a terrible idea. Basically, in the post-cookie world, there's kind of two approaches. One is still you have to opt out of being followed everywhere, which is just a huge pain because almost everybody has that rigged in such a way that you have a giant accept here button or you go into some kind of gauntlet to opt out. But what Google wants to do is basically store all the tracking stuff inside your browser, and then that's used to target ads at you, rather than have it go out into the giant mess of operators that are out there. It's, to me anyway, I think it's a giant antitrust thing, and it's a huge threat to the rest of the advertising marketplace as it stands. But it's a creepy marketplace. It's one where you're being shot ads personally, rather than aimed at a general public because you're reading a sports thing or you're reading some other thing. To me, the main thing is we need to have our own controls on our own side, so we don't have to depend on a little switch inside the suction cup on the tentacle of a corporate giant. And that's pretty much what the EFF says, but I'd put it more sternly than that. So that's my little piece of news for the readers.
Yeah. Isn't part of the idea of FLOC that rather than tracking you as an individual, Google says, "Oh, you're probably part of this group," and there's maybe 1,000 other people put in that same group with you?
Yeah, and that's actually what Facebook also does in its own way. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's what the Nixon administration 50 years ago called plausible deniability. They are plausibly denying that they are actually following you personally, but they're still profiling you, and it's still profile stuff piling up, and it begs the question of, do people really want A, to be followed, or B, to have personalized ads all the time? And some people might. I mean, there are the coupon clippers out there, and the people who don't care about privacy, and the people who don't care about all that stuff, and those include some very respected hackers. I was talking to one yesterday. But for the most part, it needs to be our choice. We need to be able to say yes to that, and in our own way, and in a way that we fully control, and not just through Google. We need to be able to do it across the entire marketplace using whatever is at our disposal, so we are independent and free and at liberty, and the rest of those good things. So anyway, that's our second news story. The biggest news for us this morning is that Jeremy Ruston is here, and I have to tell you, this is I had an emergency tweet last night or yesterday. It wasn't night, but it was for him. He's in London. I assume London, somewhere around London. Are you there, Jeremy, by any chance? Let's bring him up. There he is. I'm not hearing you, Jeremy, so you might be on mute.
Oh, you're not hearing me? I'm in Oxford.
No, I do now. There you were. Your lips were moving, but I was there. So there's Jeremy.
You can read.
Yeah, so we had our scheduled guest, who will still be on at some point in the future, for reasons we won't go into. It didn't make it, but so I scrambled, and the first person I went after was Jeremy, and I did not expect it to be a bullseye. And he responded, so I want to thank him for that. Jeremy and I go back. We met in the aughts, in the 2000 before 10s, when we were both at BT. I was that's British Telecom to people outside the UK, though BT is rebranded as just BT and no longer British Telecom. But it's the telco giant there that's also the biggest internet service provider, and a mutual friend of ours named J.P. Rangaswamy, who I worked for there, brought Jeremy in and brought in TWiT, which is just a really cool hack. So Jeremy, give us the kind of the top level brief on TWiT and what it is, and then we'll go into questions about it.
Sure. Hi, Doc. Thank you so much for having me. I much appreciate it. Delighted to be asked to come. So thank you. A brief introduction to TWiT is that it was an accident to start with. You know, in life, there's lots of times where you make grand plans and try and execute them. But TWiT started as an accident and sort of has proceeded by a series of random steps that I wouldn't necessarily have predicted on the very first day. And the first day, it was actually very much what you were saying in the intro. It was a demo of a user interface idea. And the idea was really simple. It was that at that time I was interested in Wikipedia, and particularly about editing Wikipedia, and realizing that to edit a wiki, you would typically open 2 pages at once in different tabs. Lots of refactoring jobs require you to do that. And obviously it's a really useful capability. So I was just interested in the idea of doing that within a page, so that rather than the browser managing these 2 different contexts, that we could manage them within the app. So I did what I thought was the simplest possible demo of that idea, and was very gratified that it got a really positive reaction from, at the time, this is 2004, from the blogosphere, which, things like all those ranking sites, I can't remember what they were called now, were Delicious was one of the very popular at the time. So there was a kind of a currency of cool stuff on the internet, and TWiT did really well, and eminent nice people said very nice things about it. But a weird thing was that people saw it as a finished web app, and didn't understand the context of it being just a throwaway demo. And so some of the feedback I got was essentially, this will be nice when it's finished. And I kind of found that frustrating, because there was no finish there. It was the most superficial thing imaginable, a web application that only runs in the browser. So I'd just done a static HTML page as a demo. And then somebody else discovered, so I'd done a static web page, and you opened it in a browser from a file URI, and then you could make changes, edit and stuff. And then when you pressed the save button, it popped up a box with the source code of the HTML file incorporating your changes, and with some hilarious copy about how obviously you can't really save changes because this is a static HTML file. And then somebody showed me these, the fact that basically all the browser extension APIs were available in 2004 in Firefox to file URI apps. So discovered that it became possible for TWiT to be a fully functioning application. So at that time, you'd have your TWiT HTML file, you'd open it in Firefox, make changes to it. You wouldn't even click save. It would just automatically in the background save it to disk, and you'd have a fresh HTML file on your disk incorporating the changes. So it was, for me, that were very unexpected from a user interface demo, but it ended up being a really interesting, an example of a thing with two very different natures. It's the experience of a web application, because you experience it in a browser and it behaves like a browser-based application. But from a user's perspective, it has the semantics of a document. It's an HTML file that I can copy, I can give you, I can take a copy before I modify it so that I know I can revert experimental changes and so on. So that turned out to be interesting to me, because I spent the 90s, working in big companies with Microsoft Office and so on. And it was clear that those collaboration tools, they're skeuomorphic in the sense that they emulate the media of the previous set of tools. And so I've been interested for years in what comes next. And so it turned out that even quite early on, TWiT let me explore an interesting aspect of that. And then it turned out that having a web application that doesn't need a server has two impacts. One is developers, experienced developers, think you're crazy. So I've had that a lot. In the very early days of TWiT, I did a tech talk at Google, and just it sounds ridiculous, but the sort of communications issue of explaining to this very clever audience that that this was a web application that didn't require a server. I'd literally say those words, and then somebody would pipe up in the background, so is the server PHP? And it was, it's like quite a thing to get your head around. So that's one thing. People react to it as being, a strange beast that abuses the browser. But the thing is, actually, it lowers the barriers to entry in a way that's turned out to be profoundly significant. So lots of things I, as a developer, as a web developer, take for granted are really superpowers in today's world. Our ability to make web pages, to understand what that web page over there is doing, and duplicate it. Those are superpowers. But the barriers to those powers are really high at the moment. And obviously, we have tools like, WordPress, so for many years, that's been an approachable way of making a certain type of website. But if what you want doesn't fit the template of every other website in the world, which it turns out most of them do, of course, then TWiT is infinitely customizable by people without having to surmount that barrier of managing a server. So sorry, that was probably too long an intro. Does that make sense?
Oh, no, it's perfect. I want to jump in, Jeremy, and ask, or make an observation first and then ask a question. I find it interesting. We interview people about lots and lots of open source projects, and some of them start as the result of a felt need. Like, I need something to help me with this, and none of the applications that are out there really fit what I need. Whereas others are, I had this flash of insight, I want to build something around that. And it sounds like you didn't sit down and said, man, I need a wiki where I can put all my thoughts together. It sounds more like you sat down and said, this is a really cool idea. Let's play with it and see what happens.
And the bit of the idea that was the trigger for me was actually the trouble I was having with writing. So at the time, I admired lots of people. I imagine Doc was blogging at the time, who were sharing their thoughts through blogs, and I found it really difficult to do that. And it's just me that I'd probably rather be writing code, and I find writing English quite hard. I have to endlessly go back and refactor it. And I felt that one of the reasons was because the tools that we use encourage you to write long screeds. And in fact, that, I believe, is my habit. If you press a button on me, I'll go and, I can rabbit on indefinitely. But, and those tools play to that. Word encourages you to write a page full of stuff. Why not? You might as well fill up the whole page. So I was interested in tools, in the idea of a tool that encouraged you to write as small as possible. And, the thinking there was that would make the writing process easier. So I thought if I could scaffold the writing process so that I would pull the thoughts out of my head one by one as little micro content thoughts, and then weave them back together into some kind of sense so that other people can read them. So I was driven by a kind of an introspective desire, I guess, to improve my writing skills. And I'm still not a blogger, so it didn't work.
So you mentioned that back in 2004, a local file is able to hook into the browser extension API and use that to be able to save changes. I gather that no longer works, probably for security reasons. So
yeah.
How does that work now if someone uses which, by the way, I don't know if everybody understands this. TWiT is a single file. It's an HTML file that has a bunch of JavaScript in it. You download it, you open it in your browser, and you have an empty wiki that you can edit, you can build. It's very impressive. It's very novel. How does saving changes work now? Because it's not practical to just leave a browser tab open forever.
So no, it was this was a strange part of the journey that it turned out that Firefox had this amazingly. I mean, it flagged up a warning, but it was still a stunningly useful capability. And then I found something very similar in Internet Explorer using ActiveX and HTA files. So back in the day, yeah, you could save in all of the dominant browsers at the time. And then around about 2000, and we replaced, we wrote browser extensions for a bunch of different browsers, for Firefox particularly, when they did turn that off. And then about 2010, when HTML5 came out, it had a very simple but thrilling capability, which is the ability to save files that you can, in JavaScript, you can create a DOM element representing a link. You can put data into it, RAM data into it, or you can point it at an external URL, and then you can programmatically click it and cause the file to be downloaded. So that means that from that point, I felt TiddlyWiki's future is actually assured, because there is now a technique that's within the standard for saving changes that there's a reasonable chance that'll work forever. So that means, at its simplest, the way you use TiddlyWiki in a sort of naked Chrome, you go to tiddlywiki.com, save it, and you should save it by pressing this big download button. And then when you open it, your own copy of it from the file URI on your desktop or something, you make changes. And then when you press save, Chrome will download a new copy of it. And so every time you press save, it'll just download a new updated copy. So then in your downloads folder, the most recent file is the most recent copy of your data. But also you've got a full audit trail, because all the other files are still there too. So it sounds, for those of us who are used to being able to automate our lives and make them comfortable, it sounds really weirdly lumpy, but actually it's a one-click save that, as long as you understand what's in your downloads folder afterwards, it's foolproof. So that gives us a baseline that now works on iOS devices, all desktop browsers that I've seen. And now we've built on top of that some ridiculous number of alternative saving methods. I think there's like 20 or 30 now. So it's one of those, a problem that maybe lots of open source projects have, that we have a sort of embarrassment of choice in a few places. Every open source expands to fill every little niche, doesn't it?
Yes, that can be a problem. You begin to have a paralysis as a result of too many choices.
Exactly.
So
Exactly.
I want to dig into that though. So TWiT was originally intended to be just a single user wiki. It looks to me, just looking at the documentation, it now supports, or maybe it always has supported, this idea of also being a multi-person wiki. You could, well, obviously the tiddlywiki.com webpage is TWiT, it seems. So there is now capability to, host it on a server or on the cloud and have multiple people view it, multiple people edit it. So first off, how does that work? What does the back end look like on that?
Well, in 2010, about 2011, in fact, when I left BT, I decided that I was going to rewrite TWiT, and it's the thing we're warned against, to not do a 2.0. But by that time, I'd become certain that it was useful, and that the code that I'd had from 2005 to 2010 was, although awesome in lots of ways, wouldn't support the kinds of things I wanted to do in the future. So rewrote it and made it so it ran under Node.js and in the browser. So to TWiT, obviously, those are the same environments, and even Node.js. Then there's very small sort of areas that you need to work around in terms of differences. But it meant that TWiT incorporates a lot more infrastructure than modern projects. So it is its own build system. Oh gosh, that's me. It's its own build system, and it has its own common JS module loading system built into it. And that's the sort of thing that can seem a bit crazy from the outside. But sometimes you make a simple design decision and you follow through the consequences, and it takes you to unexpected places. And this duality that we therefore have. On the one hand, I can have a TWiT over here that's a single HTML file. I can archive that for 100 years. I can be reasonably confident that it's going to work. The all-in-oneness is awesome. I can't lose the images. I can't mismatch the version of the original file in the images. And yet, with a single command, I can convert it into what we call a TWiT folder, a structure where each individual data item is a separate file. So you can work with Git, for instance, in the normal way. So it's another sense of that duality that I really like. It's and it's obviously isomorphic applications, as they're called, applications that work in the browser and in Node.js are kind of common. It's a common approach. But when you think about it, there aren't so many projects that use the browser, as a platform so brutally, where when TWiT is running in the browser, there is nothing else. It's its own thing.
So I would love to hear your thoughts on that 2.0 rewrite. There's kind of two, probably more than this, but there's at least two lines of thought that I've seen kind of in the open source world. One of which being, you've written your code, you got to stick with it. Don't ever try to do a ground up rewrite. And the other thought is, the first time you wrote this code, you had no clue what you were doing. Of course you need to do a 2.0 rewrite. Which one did you find to be true?
I think it's probably a matter of timing it, isn't it? Is actually the thing. That there's a lot of value in putting off the rewrite, because once you've got a rewrite coming, then actually being able to defer it as long as possible often is is really beneficial, because. But for me, I think I have to stress how the original TWiT was literally the first time I'd written JavaScript. And I looked at other people's JavaScript and I thought, oh, this is C. And so I kind of wrote a bunch of JavaScript as if it was C. At that time, we knew about DHTML, as it had been called only a few years before. So I knew about simple DOM manipulation. But so the code's terrible. And it turns out that its terribleness has been quite beneficial. That people argue that TWiT Classic, as it's called, is much easier to hack on, it's much easier to understand, and it lacks a lot of that infrastructure. It's a whole pile of sort of global JavaScript stuck to the sides of the wall of a room, whereas TWiT 5 is like walking into a room, with a huge piece of machinery with a careful sort of guide and paraphernalia around it.
I can't help but laugh because I feel your comments about JavaScript. I feel that so far deep down in my soul. I started on JavaScript.
I've learned to absolutely love it.
Yeah, it is. It's a fun language to write in. But my original approach to JavaScript is basically to keep hammering my head against the code until I finally make something work.
Well, I now actually, in all seriousness, face the prospect of another rewrite, because JavaScript has moved on in these 10 years just to stunningly interesting places. The new module stuff, all the ES6 stuff. It's the first language I've become familiar with that's had the luxury of accreting convenience features for so long. And, although we have these sort of deep race memories of JavaScript in the past, actually, the modern language is really expressive, and I'm blown away by it. So I look forward to that, but I don't think that'll be yet.
So I want to report that that our back channel here is full of compliments for you, and for TWiT. Of course, complimenting your voice, first of all. You have an enviably warm voice. But one guy says, it's pretty cool. And the guy says, no, it's really cool. So there you go.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
So one guy says, you should try Rust.
Again, I've been thinking of that Rust is a very interesting language, and of course you can compile it to WebAssembly. And the most interesting architecture for me for a future TWiT is a WebAssembly blob of something that could run, on an Arduino or Raspberry Pi, a sort of microkernel that runs in the browser, would run as a shared worker or something. With obviously a whole load of ES6 JavaScript tying things to the DOM. But yeah, that's such an interesting world we now live in. 20 years ago, I think maybe youngsters take this for granted, but 20 years ago, there wasn't innovation in programming languages. There hadn't been for years. There were obviously lots of platform innovation, which drove improvements to tool chains and so on, but not people just dreaming up whole languages. Maybe Python was the start of that era.
So I'm wondering, you've gone over the evolution of TWiT itself, and of yourself as the prime mover there, as the maintainer and the author of it. How has the development community changed over that time?
Wow, TWiT is, I think, different than a lot of projects because it's an open source project that serves the needs of end users and not other developers. And I often feel that makes it almost such an outlier in the open source world, because a lot of the contributors to the project are totally inexperienced in normal development terms, use the GitHub web interface and so on. So the privilege for me of working on open source is that I get to have this relationship with the users of the thing, and I learn from them. And I guess for TWiT, I think of the development being kind of driven by the community in a way that I suspect other projects aren't, because there's a very clear user base who aren't developers, and so the only way that they're going to get what they want is by developers on the project saying yes, so that's a good idea. And so I've got limited time to spend on anything on the project. So my goal is to try and tune in to what the universal needs are that get revealed through the sort of dialogue that we have within the user community. And of course, GitHub has been amazing. It's sort of cropped up since original TWiT and has made it, as easy as it could be for me to work with other people on contributions. And I'm incredibly lucky to have developers who are way more knowledgeable than me contributing to the project. So there's certain, I'm sure this is the same for all project owners, but there's certain dark, scary areas. And for me, they would be my GitHub Actions workflows, which I completely rely on other people for.
So is this your day job, or is there a TWiT Foundation, or what? How does that work?
Been very lucky in this regard. I think it's taken a while, but I now I support myself through work on TWiT. So when I was at BT, I had a great job, but my responsibilities obviously were in terms of BT's interests and not TWiT's success, and that's right. That was what I chose to do by taking that job, was to put their needs first, so to speak. That's what it means to work for somebody. I'm so sorry. That made me lose it. Doc, can you just remind me what your question was?
Oh, I was wondering what is this your day job, or do you also consult?
Sorry. Yes.
And yeah.
Sorry, it's so easy for me to get distracted. So when I first left BT, I did any consultancy work, for sort of CTO stuff for anybody, anything that I could to kind of support myself while I was first working on the project. And then over the last, 5 years, I've gradually moved to the point where I now run a little one-person consultancy with a small handful of clients who are all paying me essentially for the same thing. They're all buying TWiT from me, but with some kind of wrapper or redevelopment. So that's been really cool. That now that my clients, I think, understand the benefits of participating in open source. They see that they get stuff that I do for other people and that the community does, and how that benefits them. And even though it means that I'm not on the mailing list 24/7. I have a very clear need to set aside time when I work on, the work for my clients. But that work at least is all TWiT work, and so there's a definite. It's a great position to be in. I mean, I feel very lucky to have been able to get there.
I'm wondering. So you mentioned earlier about giving users superpowers, and that in fact is when I worked for about 1.5 years for Mozilla in the teens. Part of our goal there was to give users superpowers. I'm not sure it happened exactly the way we wanted it to. That's still my goal in the world, is to give everybody much more power than they have. So I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit more and what you're looking for, because it seems you've got a really good relationship with people, which is really different, I think.
Well, one of the many areas I knew nothing about, and I had, I don't think I could have intentionally set out to have achieved this goal. But I always think of the perfect example of TWiT is a high school volleyball teacher in the US who set up a incredibly intricate TWiT to track the progress of the students playing high school basketball. And it's if there was a screenshot, imagine something as complicated as the worst expenses system that you've ever seen, but made kind of nice looking. And it's basically that. So it's a very intricate, specific tool that only makes sense for people who are teaching a team's worth of people to play volleyball. And it gave them places where you could fill stuff in and then get stuff appearing over there that you could print out. And the thing I loved about that is I don't think that we've yet discovered a business model for selling tools for high school basketball. And yet, if we were dads with kids on high school basketball, we'd be itching to computerize all of that, because it cries out for it. So yeah, that's when it happens. It's stunning. You see things that you just wouldn't see any other way. Because I say, it's like imagining a generic internet launch site, but it's for high school basketball, and that would just be the craziest niche. So I think what has been it's surprising that TWiT enables people to do a surprisingly close approximation of many of the things that we take for granted in software development. So Git, for instance, is one of the things that gives us superpowers, because it means it hides our mistakes. It means that we're completely protected against mistakes, and we know that we can make some random experiment, and if it all goes wrong, we can revert. And that's huge. Somebody trying to perfect their LinkedIn profile. I always think of that example for some reason, where you can make lots of changes all over the place. You don't have that ability to jump back. So with TWiT gives you that through the file thing. That means that I can take a copy of my personal notes, put them over here, and then do savage things, delete half of them in the process of reviewing them. And it doesn't matter because it's on a safe copy. So that enables people who have decided that they're not in, that they don't want to learn Git. It enables them to do essentially the same thing. So that combination of being a file and being self-contained means, if you imagine if every software project we worked on was a single file, source code control, and a whole load of problems would melt away. You can immediately see.
Hey, I want to jump back in and ask a quick question. A couple of questions. We obviously we do have a chat room, and they pointed out something that we noticed ahead of time. Last week we talked with I believe his name was Jeremy Lin about Dendron, a kind of a mind mapping / note taking application. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Dendron. It's interesting. It's kind of it's built on top of VS Code, and
yes.
The chat room is pointing out that this in some ways is a similar project. Like, it could occupy the same use space as far as taking notes
yes.
and organizing your thoughts. And I'm curious, particularly if you're familiar at all with Dendron, what your thoughts are about like the differences and kind of the pros and cons to either or both projects.
Well, I was only became aware of Dendron when I was looking at last week's show. It looks like a great product, and I think it's part of what I perceive to be a new kind of wave of tools for thought, as people call them. So tools that, like TWiT, are very self-consciously. I think they start out with an idea for what it feels like to have a brain and what it feels like to try and use it, and then it tries to provide scaffolding and support for it. And a lot of this has been driven by Rome, which is a classically VC-backed venture, but is also doing a phenomenal job of engaging with a community as well. And in fact, Rome I admire greatly as a design, but it's sufficiently different from TWiT that sorry, I'm talking about Rome here. That in our little world, we're serving different people, for different needs. Dendron includes the graph feature that is very popular in Rome, which is the old ones amongst us will remember the brain from, again, that sort of 2005 period.
Yeah, it's still around. Yeah. Harlan Hugh wrote it, and he still, unfortunately, is proprietary, which bothers me. I would be using it if it wasn't.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
Well, I mean, Rome is a different era, so it doesn't do that hyperbolic stuff quite the same, but it's very much the same idea, and I feel that is it's something that we have quite a primal desire to see. So a lot of us see our thoughts as little blobs of things with links in between them, and we'd like to see those links. I actually firmly am of the opinion that the lines and boxes diagrams are cognitively useless unless they've been manually laid out. So that, and all I'm saying is that, you know, if you take 25 nodes and the computer lays them out, obviously thinking about not crossing lines or something, our eyes, trained on the savannah of Africa thousands of years ago, all we see are the patterns. So we see three things lined up and we think that there's a relationship between them. But, you know, that's just an artifact of the layout diagram. So I feel that that kind of extraneous structure that, let's say, human brains can't help seeing is just overwhelms any insights that you would get from that sort of graphical view. So my own feeling is more that the way to experience those links is not by standing back and seeing a graph, but is by traveling through them. As you know, so I'm more interested in that kind of. So TiddlyWiki goes to a lot of trouble. There's a mode, if you put it into zoom in story view mode, when you click on the link, it actually, the thing you're on zooms out, and it turns out that the word you clicked on turns into the title of the thing that you clicked on. So I was interested in that sort of smooth transition to make it feel like the information is always there and you're uncovering it, sort of thing. And that I think is very different than this godlike view where you're looking down on the railway track and you're seeing, and let's say my personal notes have thousands of entries and there's no conceivable graph that could, you know, give me any insight into it. I get more insight, you know, searching for random words, to be honest.
So first off, I have been corrected in the back chat. Jeremy Lin is the basketball player. Kevin Lin is the programmer that we talked to last week.
Well, congratulations, Kevin. I mean, it's really awesome that, you know, web development has reached this point where people, you know, in the 90s, tools like this were not the kind of thing that, you know, one could get up and running in the time before one's enthusiasm departed.
So I had a thought as you were talking about these different approaches to note taking and mind mapping, and that thought is this: different people learn differently, different people think differently. Biological sciences have even taught us that there may even be a difference between the way that men and women process information. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on this idea that we have all of these different models for mapping notes and mapping our thoughts because people conceptualize and think about things differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that for me is the quest for the universal. I like that word. I like the idea that we can, and for me, the one of the principles that underpins TiddlyWiki is to be customizable. You know, that's so you've got an answer for everybody. But the most important sort of philosophical principle is this idea that information is more useful if you chop it up into small chunks. So small chunks of information are more reusable than long blocks of information. It's really obvious. You know, if I hand you a 400-page report, it's very hard to reuse any of that, both in the physical sense, but also if you were kind of trying to track between that original and that copy over there. So I think that principle for me has become very explicit, this idea of smallness, because, as I say, it links back, as I was saying earlier, to this idea of writing by trying to write intentionally in small chunks. So that, for me, is a principle that, you know, became clear to me, and I see it in all of these other products. I mean, the fact that Rome and Dendian, they use outline view as their primary metaphor. And that I guess, you know, if you were drawing a map of this space, there would be the outliners on one side and the people who are less interested in outliners on the other side. And I'm definitely on that side. So after all those in the 90s, you know, using Word outlines as a way to essentially, you know, as a note-taking tool, I grew frustrated with the way that hierarchies work. I think that people like me, so I can only speak for myself, I'm rather attracted to hierarchies, and arranging a hierarchy, like back in the old days, arranging your Outlook folders, it's that kind of fun that feels a little bit like work, but probably isn't really work. And so I've come to think that hierarchies are a terrible primal way of organizing things. So TiddlyWiki loves hierarchies, but it has a bunch of ways to generate hierarchies from scattered individual tiddlers, rather than presenting the hierarchy as the primary metaphor. And yeah, that seems like quite a big difference in approach between the different tools that you'll see. But then people have done plugins for TiddlyWiki that make it look stunningly like Rome. That's the trouble with software; it's so plastic and changeable. And obviously, the stuff that's pure user interface, there's no back end people to renegotiate with, so it's really fluid and easy to change it.
That's actually a great segue into what I wanted to ask next, and that is, as flexible and as useful as this software is, I'm sure you have seen people abuse it, we shall say, use it for things it was not intended for. And I'm curious, do you have a couple of stories about just the strangest or most surprising uses someone has made of TiddlyWiki?
That's interesting. Well, I'm trying to think of things that other people other than me have done with it. But I don't think I'm often surprised by what people do in the sort of technical software sense. I feel that a lot of what I learn is about people. As one of TiddlyWiki is very lucky to have people all around the world. We have 20 translations or something maintained by different people around the world, and I'm very conscious that it's although my part of the TiddlyWiki world speaks English, it's a sort of broad community that includes lots of people for whom English is not their first language. But my abuses of it, so they would be. Go ahead. I, at Joe Armstrong's behest a couple of years ago, wired it up to Sonic Pi, which is made by Sam Aaron. It's a fantastic computational music synthesizer system. So that was a kind of crazy, unexpected thing to do with TiddlyWiki, and something I'd actually like to explore more of. This plasticity of the user interface when you ally it with hardware, or quite an interesting area. Making a plastic front end for something that's concrete, physical thing in the physical world. The other thing, I guess, I'm continually surprised that TiddlyWiki runs anywhere JavaScript will. So this is more like being surprised by JavaScript. But the first time I just wrapped TiddlyWiki up and ran it as a Lambda, that was pretty mind-blowing. And it just, with a little bit of glue at the top and the bottom, broadly, it works, and you can do amazing things with a serverless TiddlyWiki. That's a nice one. Yes. Yeah. There's many. I love looking at people. It's wonderful when people publish blogs. Any kind of, it's great when people share. But maybe you can show that again, because when people share material in TiddlyWiki, this person is sharing at many levels. They're sharing content, and they're sort of choosing what to share. They're sharing technical stuff in a kind of the way the internet's supposed to be, but it's their design, and it's much more their kind of their setup than choosing an off-the-shelf WordPress theme and customizing it, as most of us would do.
So you can use TiddlyWiki as a drop-in WordPress replacement, eh?
Yeah, what I really want to do is to make it talk to the WordPress API, so that you can have a bunch of pages in WordPress that you edit in your WordPress editor, but you can also see them and edit them within TiddlyWiki. Again, with that duality idea, so that you could have, say, people writing content on WordPress that don't know anything about TiddlyWiki than some other people over there that are tying that writing together in this TiddlyWiki that grabs the content through the API.
So we did have a quick question from the chat room I wanted to get to. Micro asks, you've mentioned Rome a few times. Are you talking about org Rome?
No, I could be as well. The org Rome and Dendrian, indeed, the fact that they're sort of parasites sitting on top of something else is something I love. And in fact, TiddlyWiki does that. TiddlyWiki is a browser parasite. It reuses the browser for the infrastructure that you need to build a note-taking app. And yeah, it's awesome. And I've seen people do, in the old days, crazy stuff in Visual Basic for applications, to the same effect in other applications. But yeah.
We did have.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
You got another question for go for it, Jonathan.
We did have one quick question from the chat room to follow. Jojo to Answer asks, how safe is the system? Do you have security? Is there any type of encryption built into it?
Yes, there is actually. So one of the first things I did very early days was make it so the single file edition incorporates the Stanford JavaScript library, which is luckily still regarded as a reasonable library to encrypt the contents of the wiki. So you can have a single file. When it opens, it prompts you for a password, and then it decrypts the content. I don't ever use that feature myself because it's incredibly easy to lock yourself out of the file. It's properly encrypted, and there's nothing. I get lots of questions on the group. Every so often there are questions on the group about how you crack this thing, and you can't. But it's also, it feels better to make the encryption be a concern of a different layer. So basically, let TiddlyWiki create an HTML file, have something else that handles encryption that you can independently verify, is a nice pattern. But yeah, it's there if you want it. And of course, when you work on TiddlyWiki, you can turn the Wi-Fi off and it's totally on your machine. So that's very beneficial. That there's, for the times where you don't want to be or can't be connected to a network, and that includes privacy, TiddlyWiki keeps working just fine.
Well, I hate to say we're actually at an hour. We were also noting with each other in the back channel how fast this has gone, which is a great sign of a great guest and a great topic. So we always conclude with a little series of questions, and the first one is always, is there anything we haven't asked that you wish we had?
Probably. I'll probably think of it afterwards. No, I must say.
I'm sure we'll think of it later, right?
It's been a pleasure that you've asked great questions that that strike right at the technical heart and the most interesting things about what I've been doing. So no, that's awesome. As I say, but there's many things we could talk about. But I think you've done a great job of keeping me focused on useful things. So.
Speaking of that, the second question is our control question. We just ask every guest if they don't already talk about it. Is, do you have anything to say about blockchain?
It's really important that we have people who are interested in crypto who aren't tied up in blockchain. I like that blockchain may turn out to be important. Is important. But things like IPFS. I'm working on a project with Fission at the moment that's based on IPFS, which is to me has always been a thrillingly interesting protocol.
Yeah, that's good.
Yes, did I answer the question?
Yeah, that's a good answer. That's a good answer. And the final two are, what are your favorite text editor and scripting language?
Oh, those are also great questions. I use Sublime Text 3, and I mean, I look at VS Code and try it out every so often, and really appreciate what they've done, and maybe I'll switch. But for me, that native performance of Sublime Text aims to be like butter, and it really is. And you said favorite scripting language. Weirdly, I've only been learning Bash, I think actually I'm on a Mac, so it's ZSH, for the last 5 years, and I feel a bit like the grumpy teenager who, aged 21, finally agrees to read Shakespeare. That Bash is glorious. I mean, it's one of the crowning achievements of Linuxdom, and it's really only recently that I kind of pushed myself to actually look things up rather than just Stack Overflowing them, and to read the real documentation. And yeah, it's a stunning superpower. I mean, I'm still at the level of knowing enough to know how much more there is to learn and how many pitfalls there are and so on. But there's I think it's the place. That's the place where I see the Unix vision most clearly, I suppose.
Well, that's fantastic. You reminded me that one of the inventors of Bash is a neighbor here, and I need to have him on the show. So, great show.
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Jeremy. This has been absolutely fantastic to have you on the show, and we will have to have you back. We say that to everybody, but we mean it especially for you.
It was a great pleasure. I really enjoyed it, and talking to you both. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So, Jonathan, that was great, huh?
Oh yeah, super interesting guy. I definitely agree with your. You mentioned it in the Slack channel before. I think last night even. What a lovely voice! I could just listen to this guy talk all day. If he ever wants to give up on developing source code, maybe he could take up a career in reading audiobooks for Audible.
Well, there's yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
So, I was just gonna say I love the project. There's things about Tiddly that's really cool, TWiWiki. Again, the idea that you can have multiple bits of your wiki open at one time, that's cool. But what I didn't realize is that it's self-contained. And what that lets you do is, with essentially no effort, you can start a wiki, which, we don't think about that very often because, you have a project that you want to do. Like, for example, there is a alternative social media network that's fully open source. In fact, we need to have them on at some point to talk about it. Mastodon looks really cool. Yeah. I've been telling myself for weeks now, hey, I need to go, set up a VM, build a Mastodon instance, blah, 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 get it going, get on there. But it's going to take me, like a 3-hour block of time to just sit down and work through all the technical details of making it work. TWiWiki, you can get started in 15 seconds. You go to TWiWiki and you hit the download button, and then you click the downloaded file, and you're there, and you're ready to go and start typing. That is incredibly powerful. It makes it really hard to procrastinate something that you need to take notes about. I love it. I think it's great. That's great.
An interesting thing to me about the show is the discussion about how our minds work, because like, for example, I'm known as a writer. I am a writer, but I'm also a photographer. I'm a very visual guy, and I love outlining, and I don't like mind maps. I think in the same way as Jeremy doesn't like mind maps, and quite similarly. But I like the Brain. The Brain was actually a really cool tool, and again, I wish it was open source, but it was. It's worth taking a look at. People. It's still called the Brain, I think. But it's really just a way to organize. I mean, it isn't a mind map of the usual sort where, children of children go off in all directions. It's more or less just a way to look at things. But it's just it's just really interesting how people's minds work. And then also the fact that this just came out. It was almost an accidental discovery by Jeremy, and it's just fantastic. So yeah, give us your plugs so we can.
Oh, sure. So the main thing the main place you can find me outside of FLOSS Weekly is over at hackaday.com. Run the occasional article, and every Friday morning I go live with a security article, kind of a security roundup for the week. As far as I know, I was one of the first to talk about one of the first big places to talk about the Microsoft Exchange hack that's going on right now. That's kind of a big deal. In fact, we were talking about that on the IRC. That is, there's some question as to what government it was, but it's one of the foreign governments developed this very sophisticated exchange hack, and it got discovered by one of the network intrusion detection systems. Found the attack on the wire, and now everybody, their hair is on fire because we all know about it now. But there, Patch Tuesdays coming up. We'll look through and let people know if there's interesting things there. Just kind of trying to help people keep their keep their finger on the pulse of what's going on in the security world. So check that out over at hackaday.com every Friday morning.
I'll just plug twit.social. I forgot we have that at Twit.
Yeah.
So twit.social is a Mastodon. And not extinct like the animal. So, always an advantage. Okay, everybody, thank you so much. Next week we'll have on Dries Beitert, who is the inventor of Drupal and runs Acquia, a very successful company. That he was scheduled before. We've been moving the schedule around. I'm reasonably confident we'll have him on this time. So looking forward to that or whatever else we're going to be doing next week. And so thank you very much. This has been FLOSS Weekly. We'll see you next week.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you are interested in checking out all things smart home and Internet of Things, then you should check out Smart Tech Today, the podcast I, Micah Sargent, do with my co-host Matthew Casanelli. It's all about the smart home and improving your automations.